Going to start the share screen now. If let's see if that's okay. Let's see.
Mark, while you're doing that, I'd
Yeah,
like to interrupt for just a second and tell people about the questions.
sure.
Okay, so the Mark's got this talk divided into sections, and at the end of each section, he'll handle questions, but you can put your questions in the chat, and I will wrangle them.
Yes. Yeah, I made 3 or 4 breaks during this talk so that we can stop after each topic and talk about whatever that we've been talking. If if uh, if there are more questions after 2 or 3, we might wait on some of those until the end. Um, let's see. The I have some references at the end of this if you want to write any of them down. I didn't know of any way to share a bibliography on paper for you, so I'll put those down and leave some time for people to jot things down. I didn't write out any long website names with backslashes and colons and weird words, so but I put some phrases that you can Google, and I've checked this out. I guarantee that the top link will be the website that I'm talking about. Um, the oops, I joined Master Gardeners in 2017 after I partially retired because I've been gardening all my life, and I wanted to do some gardening better than I had been before because it was pretty much of a hit and miss proposition. And I realized if I knew more about what I was doing, I could do better. Marty or somebody wrote a small article on the online newsletter about my being involved in a hugelkultur. And this was the beginning of my garden where we changed to a gas fireplace and had a lot of firewood left over. And I'd heard about the hugelkultur through the Master Gardeners, where you put a lot of wood or other organic debris in a pile, and then you place soil on top of it. And as the wood or other material decays, it creates nutrition for the plants and actually creates a little bit of heat, so it extends the growing season and holds water a lot better. So I started this, and I put another 5 yards of topsoil on top of this. And last year, this was my squash garden. Um, this year, I'm going to do root vegetables and try those and see how they work. But I'm kind of terminally curious about things, so I always have to try everything once. And I've got a lot of different kinds of gardens in my place. It's my first, you can see the netted trees in the back. That was my first attempt at moth and worm eradication. And then my brother-in-law, Jim Black, I don't know if any of you know him. He is Beth's brother. He's managing our beehives too. So we have several interests going. A lot of the information I'm going to share comes from this publication from the University or Washington State website. And I'll mention it at the end if you want. It's a PDF file of about 30 pages or so. And I encourage people to download it. It has a lot of good information that's research-based. There are some publications that involve sort of home remedies for pest control and fertilizing, but we literally aren't allowed to share or comment on those things because they aren't backed with research. And although I like the books, I've got Jerry Butler's Impatient Gardener, and I like to read some and follow some of his practices. I've got another book by Steve Solomon called The Intelligent Gardener, which has some formulas for organic fertilizers that I use. If you want to look at for a book for raised bed gardening, there are obviously a lot of options. So you can pretty much pick anyone at random, and they'll probably give you most of the most important information on these. I haven't read any of these. This was a Google image search for raised bed gardening books, and this was what I got. So I can't really speak to any of those. I think I have 1 or 2 of them, but I can't even remember which ones I have. And I picked them at random anyway, so I couldn't really say if they were better or worse than any of the rest. But like I said, they all probably have good information. I'll talk briefly on planning or thoughts about what to do before you start, kinds of design options, materials, building a soil for the bed, picking your plants, and fertilizer. And I'll speak briefly on integrated pest management. It's sort of the newer way of looking at pest control that doesn't just involve the chemicals. I look at a big box hardware store and I see a third of the shelf space is devoted to materials that help things grow, and 2/3 of the shelf space is devoted to material that kills things, which kind of speaks to how we think about pest management. But there are other ways of thinking about it and going about management as well. I'll just speak to those briefly. I grew up in Port Townsend. We had sort of a family consortium. Our family supplied the fish and the game meat and the eggs and the milk and the beef to our family. And my grandparents supplied the vegetables, the berries, and the fruits. Like, I still remember telling my mom, I'm tired of eating salmon, which I don't say anymore, but those were times when we could catch a lot more fish. These two were caught out of a rowboat out front of our house at North Beach. 2 years ago, unfortunately, this is still relevant. I made these slides on a vegetable gardening presentation where the confluence of COVID and a lot of significantly large wildfires damaged the seed production in the Northwest. At the same time, people started thinking about growing their own vegetables. So even now, if you look at an online catalog, you'll see a lot of sold out banners across some of the more popular seed strains. The other part of this that's even, again, more relevant now, unfortunately, is with prices on the rise, food banks need a lot more food. And the motto, add a row, has been floating around the gardening community the last couple of years, encouraging gardeners to put in some extra space for food that can be donated to the food banks. I have a nearby food bank close to where I live in Clearview. It's in Maltby, that we give our extra vegetables to. A lot of advantages to raised bed gardens. The soil management is easier. There are no encroachments from other materials from outside. It's easier to contain the water and the nutrition. It drains better. It gets warm sooner in the season. Of course, it gets cooler earlier also. So it's more of a spring and summer type gardening proposition. It's just easier access. You can build a raised bed as high as you want to make it easier to reach down. And it's also usually designed narrower so you can reach across it. Greater yield for, if you've had a regular open square or whatever garden, you notice, at least I have, that the vegetables and crops tend to peter out as they approach the edges of the garden. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe that's because I'm not watering it well enough or fertilizing it more thoroughly enough, or if there are other things, people cutting corners and walking around the edges closer. But you get more yield per square foot and moderately less pest prone. Most of what gets into my garden flies or is a mammal. So I don't have a lot of trouble with voles. I've had moles dig piles right next to my garden, but it's sitting on hard pans, so they can't really get under the lumber. And it can be placed on any surface. It can be terraced on a slope, put on a rooftop, or put on hard ground like mine. This is the only disadvantage I can think of. If you're using wood, it has a limited lifespan, but most of the other materials will last longer. And if anybody's had experiences that they want to share during the question period, that they want to say that this was a problem, it's a good topic for discussion. Let's see, I didn't really cover a specific topic there, but if there are any questions at this point, I can take them. Okay. With my screen sharing, I can't see the chat box, so I'll have to depend on Marty or Janice to.
Nothing yet. Nothing yet.
Okay.
I'm dealing with.
have
Okay,
a
hang on a minute, Susan. I'm dealing with a lot of people that can't get in.
Oh,
So I'm trying to send the meeting ID to some people that couldn't get in. Okay, go ahead, Susan. But
oh,
better to
well,
do this in the chat than in the next round.
Mark,
Mhm.
yeah, you mentioned not using wood. In our old house, we used like railroad ties, which I think probably were not good to do because they have creosote or something. But what do you recommend? What material besides wood?
I'll have a section for materials in a little bit, so I'll
Okay.
cover that. And if you still have questions, and you're right about the creosote, I'll talk about some things that I've done for pressure treated wood to
Okay.
minimize the possibility of leaching.
Okay, thank you.
But it's a good question.
Excuse me for interrupting. My name is Kathy Newcomb. For those that are having difficulty getting in on the link that was sent by email, if you just click the join meeting button in Zoom and then manually enter the meeting ID and password, you'll be able to get into the session.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks. Placement isn't something to think about before you even look at materials and shapes or configurations. How much sunlight, and I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides as well, of where you're going to get your water source and how far you have to carry it or pipe it to get to the garden. I don't mean to say zoning in terms of R5 or anything fancy, but the right of way for our streets is a lot wider than most people realize. So you might want to check on the right of way width for the streets if you're going to put a garden anywhere near, like tertiary streets have like a 30-foot right of way, and it's sometimes 6 or 8 feet beyond the edge of the pavement. So keep that in mind for any limitations. Or if you don't want it close to your neighbor's or somebody's fence or something like that, you might check with your neighbors if you're going to plant next to the adjacent to a fence. Orientation, I'll have some slides on that too. Substrate, what's underneath, anything can be underneath it. Just prepare the surface before you put it down. Like I said, I have hard pay on most of my property, so under 2 inches of turf is just, the shovel rings when I strike this material. I don't know whose yard this is, but it could be anybody's. We live here. These are taken in a yard over the course of a year, and it's obvious that there's not one place in that yard that doesn't get shade during some part of the day. But most plants can do fine with indirect sunlight. So even the ones that are in the shade for part of the day will do fine. And the fact that the sun moves is really great because that removes a lot of shadow for a good part of the day for any placement. But it's more like this. If you draw a map, I'm assuming that north is up on this drawing because there doesn't look like there's any sunlight on the top surface or above the part of the house that's on the top part. But you can draw this out if you want and look at places where there is more sun. And this person apparently put this vegetable garden where it looks like there's a lot more sun. When I built my first garden, I built it with a north-south orientation. And so I planted the rows across so that they would get an even amount of sunlight throughout the course of the day, and they wouldn't be shaded. And you can see that the plants at the bottom are radishes. The ones in the middle or upper middle are bush beans, and the ones at the top are sugar peas or vining peas. So that the short ones are in the front and they won't, this was in the south is at the bottom of this. So the short plants won't block the light from the taller ones. I had to move the garden because I had to make room for a larger greenhouse. So I placed it in an east-west orientation this time. Excuse me. And as you'll notice, or if you've noticed before, the top cap on this that I placed is no longer there because it was Douglas fir, which has a lifespan of about 5 years. And it started to disintegrate, so I removed it. I planted tomatoes this time because I've kind of got a growing interest in them. And we're looking at the north side of the garden, but you may not be able to see, I've got 2 rows of tomatoes there. There are 2 rails at the top. The sunlight does well enough shining through the plants in the far row that obviously the plants on the northern row get enough light too. Any questions about how to plan or where to place things?
I don't see any questions popping up.
Okay, good. I timed this at about 35 minutes with my wife Patty last night. And she said you should talk slower, so I'm trying to talk slower. A lot of different options for design, how deep you're going to make it and what kind of shape it's going to take. Again, there's an infinite number of shapes, configurations, and depths for a garden like this. If you want something that's easier to reach, you can plant something that's really deep, like the one on the top left. And the material you can see, we'll talk about a little bit later too, is a corrugated steel. A lot of companies are selling these now because they have a pretty long lifespan. My sister just showed me a picture of a garden she built out of redwood in California. I didn't even know you could buy redwood anymore. But redwood has a shorter lifespan, obviously, than steel, but it's longer than Douglas fir. On the bottom right is, that's not mine, but I built that. It's called a salad table. I built that, and I built it out of non-pressure treated wood, so it didn't last very long, but it was a fun project for a while where I could plant just leafy vegetables mostly that didn't need a lot of root space. Oh, by the way, do you notice the one in the lower left? You can only access that from one side, so you wouldn't want to design something that's, my garden is 4 feet wide and I can reach it from both sides. But this one is only reachable from one side, so they made it more like two feet wide. This is a chart. Again, I'm a shameless user of Google Images. And so I got this for root depth. If you want to see how much root space that you'll need for plants, they're always deeper than you think that they'll go, but they don't need as much space as they will take if they've got it. My garden is about 10 inches deep, and I plant a lot of these plants in the left column and in the middle column. I don't know if you can see, there's a little banner that's blocking the number of inches in the middle column. Can people see how many inches those are that they grow to? Okay, so I'm the only one who can't see that. But they'll usually do fine unless I grow beets and beans and cucumbers and peas and peppers in a 10-inch depth. So a lot of these will do fine. I would not plant the vegetables in the right column, parsnips especially. They go way down. And let's see. This is another slide to talk about design because I put, you can see in the bottom left, I put a layer of black plastic between the wood and the soil to avoid any toxins leaching. It's a pressure treated wood, but I wasn't sure of the age, and I'll talk about that in a second. This is another reason to leave a cap on the top. It's a place to sit if you want to weed, or a place to set things. I use a smaller basket, so I couldn't carry all these as I worked my way down. So I just set them out and then picked them up after I was done. Any design questions?
Yes, and it's funny because my chat isn't showing the questions, but now there are a bunch of questions in the chat. So instead of wood, how about containers? Is a question from Kathy.
Yeah, I was going to talk about, just touch briefly on pots because I like to grow my cherry tomatoes and some other vegetables in pots. And it was too long to share here, but I have like a 3-page handout that shows which vegetables you can grow in pots and how large the pots need to be. I was surprised at the variety that you can grow in pots because you can grow a lot of, I've grown beets in pots, I've grown carrots in pots, and a lot of cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. So you can put a lot of things in those plastic pots. You don't use the decorative ones as much because they're pretty expensive. I had 20 potted cherry tomatoes last year. So, other questions?
Yes, have you ever tried using rocks for raised bed materials?
No, but I wouldn't doubt to be a good idea. When I was digging my raised row garden, I came up with about a half of a yard of rocks, and I still don't know what to do with them. They're all really nice rounded river rocks because it used to be under a glacier. But yeah, any material that you can use that will hold up or retain some soil is a good idea. I think the next couple of questions will be materials as well, I think.
Well, and I have another couple of questions here. Do you put some sort of screen under the bed to stop moles and voles?
I put landscaping cloth down. It deteriorated over the 7 or 8 years that I had the garden there. I found that out when I moved it. But some people, if you have soft soil and moles more likely going to get under there, then you could use hardware cloth, like with a 1/2-inch mesh.
Somebody, Judy says she places cardboard under her garden bed. It seems to work okay to prevent moles.
Okay. If it works, then yeah, I would go with it. And that's a good weed block as well.
And Tracy says she gardens at Mukilteo Pea Patch, and they are currently rebuilding their beds with a pressure-treated lumber that they swear WSU says does not leach. Your thoughts?
Well, I can't speak to the specific wood because I haven't seen it or the labels, but in the last 20 years, pressure-treated wood has been using a copper compound that's safe for gardening. But anything older than that, and I can't tell you the exact year because different companies stopped using arsenic as what used to be contained in those lumbers. I wasn't sure about the age of my pressure-treated wood. I don't think it was 20 years old, but I didn't want to take any chances, so I used a plastic liner anyway. Didn't hurt, and it kept the water from seeping out between the boards anyway, so it had another advantage that way.
Is there anything in the material of cinder blocks that leaches into the soil?
Cinder blocks are made of concrete, which contains lime, so it's not a toxin. It just might raise the pH of the surrounding soil a little bit, which if you're a kind of a geek gardener like me, I like to check the pH of soil because it can affect the conversion of minerals to nutrients. It seems like if you know about pH, a 6.5 seems to be sort of the happy medium for pH levels for most vegetables. But things like blueberries and rhododendrons have like a lower pH, more acidic soil. But if you want to, again, you might consider using a liner inside the cinder blocks.
What do you use to test for pH?
There are a lot of different, there you can get pH strips where you mix some soil in the water and dip the strip in the water, or you can buy pH testing kits where you put chemicals in the water and that'll give you the nutrient levels. Or you can take a sample of your soil. Oh, sorry, there's a wand you just stick into the soil and it has a little electronic dial that will give you a rough pH, but that's graduated in half of a whole number. So it's like 6, 6.5, 7, 7.5. Doesn't get any finer than that. Or you can take your soil samples or send them to a lab for testing. And that's what I usually do from my gardens. The master gardeners send samples and recommend UMass, University of Massachusetts. They have a website, excuse me, but I'm really lazy and I hate mailing stuff in packages, dealing with post office. Not on them, it's on me. So I take my samples to a place in Burlington called Simply Soil Testing that you can mail them also, but I work one day a month up in Mount Vernon, so it's easy for me to just take the samples up in a plastic bag. You can pay online and then drive your samples up. And they have a drop box, so whether they're open or not, you can drop them off with them. And they give you a readout, printout, which will tell you the nutrient levels, some micronutrient, depending on how much you want to pay for more specific tests, give you the pH, and they'll also include recommendations for how much to add per 1,000 square feet of what a major nutrient, potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen. And that's the basic test, I think, is $20. That gives you the 3 major nutrients, the pH, and recommendations for, yeah, Susan, you're muted.
Sorry, what was the name of the place again in Burlington?
It's simplysoiltesting.com if you want to look directly at, put the address in. Spelled as it sounds, just one word.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? You're good for now? I could have put these under design, but I thought I'd put them here anyway. Pressure treated wood, we mentioned about toxins. You can line them with plastic if you're concerned. Cedar and redwood last about 10 years. The other, pine, Douglas fir, hemlock, about half that. Corrugated steel will last a lot longer, but even galvanized steel will start to rust and break down over time. The vinyl materials will last for many lifetimes. Cinder blocks, again, I thought it was that whimsical one that I showed that with the blocks painted different colors. Those were cute, but I might get tired of looking at them after a while. So, but like I said, they may have some lime in them if you want to put a liner in, but I really doubt that they'll make that much of a difference in the pH or in your plant's health. And if you do build something out of a soft material, be sure to use primed screws and use the long ones, because the short ones will eventually pull out, because the wood will bow, it will swell, it would shrink, it will crack. So use many fasteners that are long and corrosion resistant.
One more question before you go on.
Yeah.
Was there a noticeable difference in growth between the north-south and east-west beds?
It was hard to compare because I didn't grow tomatoes I grew tomatoes in the one and I grew other vegetables in the other. But both orientations seemed to work fine. I couldn't really say that. Well, but I did plant it too, so the shorter vegetables were on the south side and they didn't block any light. So those plants got daylight all day long. They were in an area of my yard that had continuous sun.
Oh, and one more, sorry.
No, it's good.
We use juniper wood from Oregon, from Dunlubber. It lasts 50 years, we're told. Do you know about that?
No, I hope so. I don't know. I don't know if it's, a lot of times they'll tell you, like, there are different kinds of pressure treated wood. Some of the pressure treated wood won't last more than 5 years in the ground because it's not that kind of pressure treated wood. And so I don't know if when they talk about 50 years, is that in the open air or is that underwater or
As a raised bed,
it's
and
a
it's
raised bed?
it's not treated in any way. It's from
Okay.
juniper trees that grow like weeds in Oregon, apparently.
Okay. Huh.
We've only had them about maybe 8 years though, so they're still fine.
I wonder if that's what they used to call Port Orford cedar.
Could be,
It's a
yeah.
product that was logged extensively in Alaska and used in shipbuilding.
Ah,
That might be
thank
what
you.
you're talking about. Mhm. Okay, anything else for now?
Not for now. You can go on.
Okay,
I feel guilty interrupting you.
no, we're good. I'm talking too fast anyway, so this is fine. For construction, I don't want to cover a lot of details about construction. Just prepare a surface, use whatever lining materials that you want. If you use hardware cloth, a coat of Rust-Oleum paint will add a couple of years at least to the lifetime of the steel, but any kind of steel, galvanized hardware cloth covered with Rust-Oleum will still rust. Just be aware that even if it deteriorates, I don't know if you'll have, I really don't think you're going to have that much trouble with burrowing critters getting underneath it. And the one thing that moles eat worms, basically, that's what their diet is. So although my raised bed garden acquired worms over time, if there are no worms in it, there'll be nothing to attract the moles anyway. I'm not saying they won't just go under there for fun, but they might not have a food source. Surface for sitting or kneeling, keeping in mind how many, will there be small children picking things from the side? Are they going to be able to reach? And fasteners for trellis or other supports. Any other questions about materials?
You have a question about cutworms in the raised beds. Somebody says she gets a lot of cutworms.
Oh, they're nasty. I'll talk about integrated pest management in a minute, and if I can't, if I don't cover that, bring that question back for that part.
Okay.
There are a million different options for how to build your soil. There are a lot of materials that people suggest for potting soil, like peat moss and, well, not peat moss, but perlite and vermiculite. They're way too expensive to put in a raised bed garden because you need to buy so much of it, it would be prohibitive. But there are 2- and 3-way topsoils that a lot of places sell. I use 3-way for mine. If you use a 2-way topsoil, that uses sand and compost, but still could use some loam, which is a combination of clay and organic material. I like the 3-way better because I don't have to add as much. But manure of chicken and cattle needs to be cured or aged for a good year before it's used. Other types of manure are not recommended, like rabbit droppings. but there are some places that use farming manure in their compost, and there are some places that don't. Now, and I'll list some sources in a minute of different kinds of soil. If you do put, I don't remember why I didn't put percentage here. Oh, I do that in the next soil or next slide. There is another publication from Washington State that you can look up if you want to. I didn't list this one at the end, but it gets a little bit science heavy. And if you want to get into it deeper, this is a good publication. It's a PDF that you can download. And I've got a banner at the bottom that blocks, whoops, where it says WSU peer reviewed, there's a number at the bottom. That's the publication number. Can you see that number?
Kind of small.
Okay.
Oh, it's tiny, yeah.
Can anybody read it? Well, if you jot down a home gardener's guide, if you preface any Google search with WSU and then whatever topic you want, you'll most likely get the top links from Washington State. So WSU home gardener soils will probably bring this one up at the top of the list.
And we have a couple of people who have put some of the information you've given us into the chat, so people can look in the chat.
Oh, good, thank you. Most computers now know where you live, so you might get a website for Wisconsin State University, but it might not be at the top if they haven't tracked you down yet. This is just one recipe for soil. There are a lot of others for potting soil, but this is just one example. 2-in-1 topsoil for half of it, plus 30% compost, or 80% 3-in-1, and then 20% of what other things that you think are important. I think everybody sort of has a soft spot for some of these materials. I use more coconut coir now because peat moss is not renewable and it's becoming a lot scarcer. This is not the same peat that they're talking about in England. That's a denser material that's used for heating. But this is sphagnum peat moss, and most of it comes from Canada. But coconut coir actually works better, in my opinion, than peat moss.
Question?
Yeah.
I have a neighbor's cat who likes to come over and use my garden bed for a toilet. What about cat poop? Is that bad or good?
I wouldn't want to encourage it. If there are ways of keeping the cat out, I would consider those. I put a fence around my raised bed, but in the past I've also put chicken wire down in some of the areas. Now, other people have other solutions that I don't have, but one of the sources that I'm going to mention at the end is the Master Gardener's email plant clinic, where any questions are fair game. And what happens is you'll send an email with a question and pictures if you got them of something, a bug or a bad leaf. And then somebody will take that and go to the database and come up with the best answer based on Washington State's information and get back to you. But there may be some other, yeah, Susan?
Oh, I also have squirrels who dig holes in my lawn and flower pots and other places. And someone said to put cayenne pepper. So I bought a couple bottles of that, and I'm not sure if it's helping much or not. Do you know about that?
I know it's something that some people use. It's not something that Washington State has researched, so I can't really say that it's good or bad. I've used pepper juice, hot sauce on some of my vegetable plants that that rodents seem to like eating. So I've sprayed that on them.
Hmm.
But it damages onions and garlic shoots. So be careful. That's the one thing I can say from experience is that hot sauce is not good for alliums,
Oh,
for the onion family.
what are you saying about garlic? It keeps the squirrels away, or it
No,
doesn't?
it's just the garlic plants. Garlic and onion plants
Yeah.
can be damaged if you squirt a hot sauce.
Oh,
So,
I see. Uh-huh. All right. Thank you.
yeah, and I already talked about sphagnum moss. It's the hardware stores are still selling it, but the sources are drying up. There used to be a wonderful place in Snohomish called Stuber's Agricultural Supply that a lot of us used for our sources because they sell a lot of materials and supplies in bulk. And they buy and sell in such high quantities, they can sell at really good prices. So we were buying a lot of these materials from Stuber's at lower prices, but they just now have gone out of business. So we'll all be going to the other stores instead. Stuber's sold these, which is part of why I'm unhappy, because I don't know where you can buy these blocks of core anymore. You can buy it in hardware stores as part of a mix of potting soil in a lot of the big box and smaller hardware stores, but it's harder to get the larger quantities if you're going to use them like in a raised bed garden. You can still buy smaller quantities for potting soil. So other questions? These are some of the sources of soil. I can't speak to which of these are better than the others. I've bought from 3 of these, and they all have their good points and downsides. I wouldn't say any of them really have a significant downside, but some little disappointments. Like Bailey's used to have clumps in their compost, but I've heard that they're sifting it now so that they don't. So it's more even. So other questions about soil?
I don't see any more questions. Oh, Sky Nursery usually sells bricks of cocoa coir if they're in stock, it says. That's from
Okay,
Nora.
that's good to know.
And we also have the Northwest Landscape Supply. They sometimes have some pretty good soil on 1/12 there, or 2/12, I guess.
Okay, good. Networking, that's what it's all about. Thank you. Picking the kinds of plants I already talked about, root depth, but other than, some vegetables you can grow a lot in a raised bed garden. If you're going to have it, arranged north to south or east west, think about the height. Tomatoes don't really block that much sunlight from, I don't know what the term would be, down sun, downwind, down whatever, behind. But there are some plants that are a lot more leafy too, that might be more of a problem with blocking things that are behind them. I'm going to show a chart of day length in a minute, so that you'll see what that means. And also I'll show a chart of value. Think of what you're growing and if it's worth the effort. These are plants that have, again, Google image day length plants will get you a lot of charts that look just like this. This came from the PDF download that I mentioned at the beginning from Washington State. So think about where you're going to plant it and when you're going to plant it. I've been growing some vegetables in a small heated greenhouse over the winter. And I had to give them some supplemental light because of some of them being, especially the roots. I'm growing root vegetables. They're long day plants, so I needed to put a light in to supplement their shorter day length. It's sometime in March, I think the day length gets to 12 hours so that any plants will be fine with a natural daylight. But up until then, it's less than 12 hours. And some plants, like tomatoes, are day neutral. It doesn't matter if you're growing them winter or summer. But tomatoes will do a lot better if you give them a longer period of light. And this is height. If you want to really look, you can pretty much figure out what vegetables are tolerant, whether it's short or anyway, though, from the seed packets and from your own experience, you can pretty much tell. Radishes are not going to be tall. Pole beans will. So just using common sense is a pretty easy way to judge that. This is from a book called High Value Veggies. If you want to look at, this is a return on investment per square foot if you grow any of these vegetables. And these are the highest value veggies that you can grow. The book contains the list of all vegetables in their return on investment, including the lower ones. You know, do you want to plant tomato or potatoes? If you can buy, a 20-pound bag at Costco for $3.95, is it worth the effort and the cost? I still like to grow potatoes just because, but I don't think I'd, plant a field full of them. All right, questions about plant selection, types of vegetables that you would grow, or flowers. I don't have any information about companion planting. That's another topic that could go on for a long time. But I'll talk about just a little bit about marigolds in the pest section.
I do have a question about potatoes. I read that you shouldn't plant potatoes in the same place year after year.
I've heard that, and I think it's a good rule of thumb to rotate plants. I don't know that it needs to be every year, but if you want to minimize the chances of attracting a particular pest to a certain spot in your garden, then rotating them yearly is not a bad idea. I'm not willing to put that much effort into my gardening, and so I might wait 2 years or maybe 3. But the longer you wait, the more chance you have of attracting something that could put a lot of damage into your crop.
Emily Kane says her spinach and Swiss chard always get wormy, but her neighbors do not. Why is this?
Well, I'd have to talk to her neighbor. I could probably learn
All
something from them too. I'll show you in a minute what I do with mine at the beginning of their growing life. And there are chemical and other methods, and maybe I'll touch on something that her neighbor does or something that she might consider doing that might help in a little bit. Mm-hmm. Other things about plants?
I don't see any more questions.
Okay. Nutrition. Most people are familiar with the 3 numbers that you see on a bag or a container of fertilizer. With those are the nitrogen, phosphorus, and the potassium. The phosphorus is the one that people are most sensitive about as far as drainage into waters and algae blooms. And it's also the one that seems to last the longest in the soil. So it might not be the most important. I send in samples. Sorry, we have some some guest dogs today, so they're a little bit wild. I lost my train of thought. Nitrogen is the most important for growing the foliage or leafy vegetables. Phosphorus is the most important for root development for root vegetables or establishing a plant in a garden. Potassium is the most important for flowers and fruits. So different plants will require different proportions of these nutrients. And I hope you can still hear me over the barking. I apologize for that. There are micronutrients that plants can use also, but when I took my samples in for testing, at the beginning of the growing season, they were they still had plenty of phosphorus and potassium, but the only thing that they were lacking was nitrogen. I did that in a raised row garden. I did it in a raised bed garden, and I took a sample from my hugelkultur garden just from topsoil that I had bought from a source from the nursery. So even with unamended soil, you can often have what you need for a garden, but nitrogen seems to be the shortest lived of the nutrients. I won't go into, organic versus synthetic. It's personal choice or professional one if you're selling or advertising your crops as organic. And OMRI certification is a sticker that you'll see on a lot of packages now that certifies it as an organic fertilizer. There are a lot of home recipes. I mentioned Jerry Baker's Impatient Gardener. He has some, and the Steve Solomon book, The Intelligent Gardener, has a recipe that I use that uses cottonseed and lime and rock phosphate and kelp meal for an organic. I put that into the soil before I start the growing season, and I also add a synthetic fertilizer for sort of a quick start after they sprout. That doesn't last as long, but the organic fertilizer lasts longer, so it does better throughout their lifespan. Getting water to the garden is another part. Broadcast watering is probably not that efficient for a raised bed garden unless you've got 3 of them side by side. I put in a drip system in most of my gardens, and I cut my water bill. I cut a third off my water bill in August, which is the highest usage month for me. There's some cost up front, but it usually returns the investment after 2 or 3 years in savings in water use. Soaker hosers are good. And watering by hand, sometimes if I haven't got my drip irrigation installed, sometimes I'll just carry a can out and water them for the first week or so until I can get everything set up. Can people hear me okay with the barking? Susan, you're...
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear you fine. I just had a question about the book you mentioned, giving organic recipe for fertilizer. Is it Steve Solomon or Steve Sullivan?
Solomon. Solomon's Mind, the king with the
Right.
sword. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, he's the fellow who started Territorial Seeds. So other questions about nutrition and watering, fertilizers?
Tracy says, when you say put in soil, do you mean tilling it in? I'm leaning to no-till. Your thoughts?
That's a big topic. It's a big argument amongst the master gardeners too. The idea of non-tilling is a wonderful one, and I really wish I could hold to it. But in my raised row garden, I always get a few miscreant voles that set up camp that manage to get through my fence. And the only way, I've tried trapping them and it doesn't work. The only way to get them out is by rototilling thoroughly and hoping that I'll pop them out in the process. But that ecosystem that builds up in untilled soil is irreplaceable, and it's really important to understand that if you don't want to till, there are a lot of reasons to not do it. But I wouldn't say till, I scratch in the organic in the top couple of inches, so just lightly till I don't go down deeper where the roots are going to be at their largest bulk. So I try to hope that I can preserve some of the original ecosystem while still putting something, because if you put the organic mixes on the top, sometimes you water them, they just form a crust and they don't really do much good that way. I use some synthetic fertilizers. I sprinkle those on the top, but when I've got drip irrigation, it doesn't always water them in because they're on the surface, and the drip irrigation only waters the area underneath the hose and spreads out in a fan underneath the soil. So whatever's on top of the soil doesn't always get through. Fortunately, it rains a lot here, so that's part. I hope this is bothering me more than it is you guys. I'm sorry. So I agree with the not tilling, but it's a personal thing, and there are other reasons that you might need to till your soil anyway. So it's not a deal breaker to be tilling your soil. Other questions?
We had a talk last month about mycelium and how they build a network in the soil, and if you till it, you break up the network. But I can see both sides of this issue. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I'm not sure if the difference between them in terms of yield is that big. A lot of people spend a lot of time talking about the theory, which is important to understand. And in some settings like agriculture and the breadbasket, a no-till practice has been found to be immensely important in reducing the need for fertilizers and pesticides. So for a large-scale operation like that, a non-tilling philosophy, I think, has been shown to be even more useful. In smaller gardens, though, I don't know if it makes that big of a difference.
Okay, no more questions right now.
Okay. Integrated pest management is sort of the latest way that governments and agricultural agencies are approaching the idea of maximizing productivity. And it involves 4 different approaches to managing pests. Cultural control, which is crop rotation, or using specially adapted, sorry, I broke my train of thought. There are some pest resistant varieties. I bought a type of basil that's mildew resistant that Rutgers University just developed and is sold by some companies. And there are a lot of different ones like that. Sterilizing your clippers to avoid spreading a virus or a bacterium. Rotating and planning harvest dates, and GMO crops. I'm saying that because it's true, not because I'm saying that's the way to do it, but I can neither confirm or deny any approaches to that. But that is one method of cultural control. They generated plants to minimize pests. Biological control, you've seen the ladybugs in bags in the nurseries. Lacewings are also used for aphids. Nematodes are little teeny worms that go into the soil and destroy some insects. And actually there's a nematode treatment for slug control. Mechanical control, cultivation, trapping, row cover. I'll show you a picture of the row cover that I use. Trapping for moles and voles, and then chemical control, which has been the first approach from people for a long time, but now agencies are looking at trying to look at all of these methods and maybe trying these other 3 methods first before trying a chemical. I was going through, my mom is 92. I was going through her house in Port Townsend last month, and I came across a glass bottle of DDT. So we have come a long way since those days, but I think we can still keep moving in that direction away from those things. This is my tomatoes in some containers suffering from what's called curly top. It's a virus that's spread by a certain kind of leaf hopper that likes to sit on leaves in the sun. So, excuse me, I put some row cover over these to keep the sun and hopefully the leaf hoppers off of the tomatoes. I can't say if it kept the other ones from getting sick, but I lost maybe 5 plants out of 40. So it might have made a difference, but I also know that sometimes if you let these things happen, you're not going to lose an entire crop anyway. But obviously not everybody's going to be planting 40 tomato plants. That's my bad habit. The little shot holes on the basil and these tomato leaves are from flea beetles. I sprayed an insecticide soap on these. It didn't seem to get much worse. I can't officially say that I recommend it, but that's what I did, so I can be honest about it. But neither did I have that much of a problem. This occurred on the ends of my rows where I had the basil planted, and nowhere else in the garden. This was a raised bed, so nowhere else in the garden did this happen except for next to the basil, which they were really after to start with, and they just happened to find the tomato as an opportunistic. A lot of insects will pick one plant and might affect another plant nearby, but sometimes they won't affect anything else at all. So when you see the list of insects on a bottle of pesticide, a lot of times it will specify, you know, basil leaf beetles or some other plant, and then the name of the insect. I put a row cover on, especially my brassicas, the broccoli, the cauliflower, cabbage, and the Brussels sprouts. During the first, until they get about 12 inches high or more, because when they're first growing in July and August, that's when the cabbage butterfly is at its heaviest. I took the row cover off after that because it was more trouble to fertilize and manage it. So, but I did not have much trouble after that point. But when the plant is young, they're most vulnerable to these kinds of pests, and that can affect their growing. But if they get a good head start without something interfering, then they often will do better, even if they are getting some infection. And let's see, I didn't pay attention to my peppers in this greenhouse that I grew them in. And when I looked one day, the aphids were just wildly infesting. So again, I couldn't tolerate this, so tolerance was not an option. But I picked them out and I sprayed them with water, because a lot of times you can just get aphids off your plants with a spray of water. But I also scrubbed them, each leaf individually, by hand to rub them off. That's a mechanic method. And put them back in, and then I used a biological method, and I left a can of ladybug beetles in the greenhouse to do their work. A lot of times if you set them loose outside, they'll just fly away, but if they're in a greenhouse, then they're kind of captive, and they lived in there for months. They had obviously plenty to eat, so that was an example. I put a fence around this to keep the animals off, because our dogs and, yes, our cat wanted to go in there. Rain is not really a pest, but the plastic you can see bunched up at the end there is what I use, and I stretch that out over the row when it gets ready to rain. That keeps them from splitting. So that's it for this and IPM. So if you have any questions, these are the sources that I talked about. If you Google any of these phrases, the Master Gardener program will give you information if you're interested in joining. The plant clinic, if you've got problems with your plants. These two words are the terms used for the websites Washington State uses for expertise on all plants and all pests that they have studied. The PDF booklet is next, and the plant mail, the plant clinic is at the bottom. Just send your email with a picture if you've got one to that.
We have a question about your plastic tubing over your tomatoes. Is it plumbing supply?
That's a cloth. It's called row cover.
I think she means the tall tomatoes that you're using
Oh,
for
oh,
a frame.
oh. Yeah, that's just hurricane fence, chain link fence rails.
Oh, it's not plastic?
Oh, I'm sorry. I've got two kinds there. The plastic on the outside is PVC that I clip the cover to.
Okay.
So when I cover with plastic, I just have some hand clamps that I clamp it to this.
I have a rabbit problem at the Mukilteo pea patch, and I'm thinking of making a kind of a short fence using PVC.
That's a good idea. Yeah, it wouldn't have to, it could be even half that height probably, and that would be enough to keep them out.
You have other ideas?
For rabbits, no, fencing like that I think would be the best opportunity. I can't think of any other options that off the top of my head.
Rabbit fencing from Home Depot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if you can see, but I've got half-inch hardware cloth around this garden here that I sunk into a trench that was 6 inches deep around it to keep the voles from tunneling. And then I put 1 inch 3-foot high chicken wire around it to keep the rabbits out.
I think we need to wrap up, but that was fantastic, Mark. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry if I went too long.
No. We're gardeners. You can't go too long, but we do have to end at some point.
Okay. All right. Well, if you want to take just a second.